This is a Hope 1032 podcast.
Warning. This episode contains mentions of domestic and family violence. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know is impacted by sexual assault, domestic or family violence, Australian listeners can call 1-800-RESPECT on 1-800-737-732 or visit 1800respect.org.au. As followers of Jesus, in whom all things were made, we acknowledge the Darug people as the traditional custodians of the country of where this podcast is recorded. We acknowledge their continuing connection to the land and waters and thank them for protecting this land and its ecosystems since time immemorial. We pay our respects to elders past, present and future, and we extend that respect to all First Nations peoples listening today.
Life's not all good, life's not all bad. My daughter got cancer while I was writing this book. But she's doing okay. You know, life isn't all good and it isn't all bad, but it continues. And that's maybe the best thing we can hope for. And the kind of the triumph is we just keep going.
I'm Georgia and welcome to Finding Hope, the podcast that reminds you of the good in the world. Each episode tells the story of someone who has found real hope in challenging times and made the world a bit of a better place while doing so. Episode 62, Dan Box. Dan Box is a Walkley Award-winning journalist and a best-selling author. He's previously worked for The Australian, the BBC and London's The Sunday Times. He's won awards in both the UK and Australia for investigative reporting, feature writing and true crime writing. Dan's most recent book, The Man Who Wasn't There, tells the story of Zak Grieve, an Indigenous man in the Northern Territory who was sentenced to life in prison for a murder he wasn't even there for. It sounds bizarre, but it's a true case. And as Dan set out to prove Zak's innocence, the resulting friendship between them both had a profound effect. Dan, I'm so excited to have you here on Finding Hope. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I was just listening to that introduction and it struck me that I have never been introduced in anything like those terms before, or even like I don't get introduced to a lot of that stuff, but I've never had anyone think about the work I do in anything like those terms because no one ever talks about the good stuff. I'm a crime reporter. My work is basically pretty miserable. I deal with people at often their most vulnerable and their most awful. And in the midst of that, I can usually see that I'm also dealing with people at often their most brave and their most heroic and their toughest. But it's very rare that anyone ever looks at what I do and notices that element. Or particularly with this story, like I can remember the moment when I wrote the end, and the book actually it is about a murder, but it ends on a note of optimism and a note of not so much resolution as there's a future, there's something ahead, and I can remember finishing the book and thinking I never get to tell these stories. It's kind of got a happy ending. It was so nice to get to do that. So to come on a podcast where you talk about those things is just a delight. It really is.
Oh, thank you. I'm really excited to be able to get to chat. And look, it is, I will put a warning out there. This is not a pretty story. This has some really hard stuff. And yeah. Dan, before I think we get into it, would like to give some context to the case and the story of Zak Grieve and this murder. In 2013, he was handed a life sentence for a murder that he wasn't there for. Can you share a little bit about, I know it's got to be brief, kind of what happened surrounding that case and how he was even handed a sentence like that?
It's a complicated murder. All murder's complicated because real life is complicated. But in short, the murder victim was a guy called Ray. And Ray was not a very nice person. Nobody deserves to be murdered. And the way that Ray was murdered was horrendous and awful, and I can't imagine his fear in his last moments. And the impact on his family, I don't pretend to be able to understand the pain and the trauma they've gone through. But Ray himself wasn't actually a very nice person. He had a long history of violence, domestic abuse, and his fiancée, or his recently ex-fiancée, had been subject to years and years of violent, coercive, and sexually abusive behaviour by him. And I feel desperately sorry for her. And yet she's the person that paid for Ray to be murdered. So her name's Bronwyn. So Ray is the victim. Bronwyn paid for Ray to be murdered. Bronwyn was Ray's fiancée. But she was also kind of Ray's victim because he'd abused her. And then she pays for him to be murdered. The person she pays is her son, Chris. Chris comes to his mum and says, long and the short of it is, I can help. I can help free you. I can help bring all this to an end. Bronwyn pays Chris to get Ray murdered. She doesn't, according to her, she doesn't know anything more about how it's going to happen. Chris goes away and gets his best mate, Zak Grieve, and a third person, Darren Halfpenny, and it will be those three that commit the murder. So that, in a nutshell, is how it comes about. Zak then, on Zak's account, and on Chris's account, pulls out of the murder. The third man, Darren Halfpenny, insists they were all there together. To complicate matters further, Darren Halfpenny is a liar, straightforwardly. He lied to the cops, he lied in court, he admitted being a liar, and when he was asked why he was lying in court, he said, basically, I don't know, but when I lie, it just comes out. There's a lot of complexities. There's a lot of, in this case, like in real life, you know, there isn't actually anyone who's good and there actually isn't anyone who's all bad. Bronwyn paid for a murder to be committed, but Bronwyn was also the victim of years of sustained domestic abuse. Ray was a murder victim. Ray also wasn't a very nice person. Chris committed a murder, but he was also trying to protect his mum. There's all these ambiguities. There's no black and white. There's just grey. And yet when you go into the grey, which is kind of what I spent a lot of time doing on this, going back to this case and looking at it again and talking to the people again, was basically going into the grey and trying to work out who was right and who was wrong. And then the realisation at the end of it, without wanting to kind of give it all away, no one's all right and no one's all wrong, and it kind of doesn't matter. They're all people. Bronwyn, I like Bronwyn. I know she paid for Ray to be murdered. I really like her and I respect her. And I think she's quite brave. And I think she's had a horrendous life. Zak, who agreed to take part in the murder, he's been a really good friend. There's a lot of grey, but that's life. And kind of coming to peace with that has been maybe the learning curve for me in this book. I've kind of made peace with, I can't work out what's right and what's wrong. I can't be the objective journalist who tells you this is the truth, this is right, that's wrong. And I'm okay with that. Life's not all good, life's not all bad. My daughter got cancer while I was writing this book. But she's doing okay. You know, life isn't all good and it isn't all bad, but it continues. And that's maybe the best thing we can hope for. And the kind of the triumph is we just keep going. Yeah, so Zak agreed to take part in a murder, which we can unpick later, but he agreed to take part in a murder. He then, on his account, chickened out and said, I can't do it, right at the last minute. But the way the law works in the Northern Territory, which is something we can get into, the Northern Territory is a great place and it's an amazing place and it's beautiful and its legal system is kind of broken. So the way the law works in the Northern Territory, if you agree to take part in a murder and you pull out, but you don't stop it happening, you don't pick up the phone and call the police, then you are guilty of murder, as if you'd been there and as if you'd carried the act out yourself. So he was found guilty on that basis. And then the way the law works in the Northern Territory, they have these things called mandatory life sentences, which is basically where the judge doesn't get to say how long you go to prison for. The politicians say, if you commit murder, you go to prison for life. And life means life, like you will die in jail unless you get paroled after 20 years. So Zak was 19 when he was convicted, so he was sentenced to jail for longer than he'd been alive. And at the time, the judge said, I don't think this is right. I don't think you were there. I don't think you should go to jail for this long a time. And he said it's the fault of the minimum mandatory sentencing provisions, which inevitably bring about injustice. And that, for me, that line there, a judge saying that the law brings about injustice, was kind of the starting point, because I remember reading that and thinking, what on earth has happened here? So that, in a nutshell, that's what happened.
Do any other states have sentencing laws like this?
Yeah. No, this is the scary thing. So minimum mandatory sentencing, you get it for murder in the territory. You also get it for a whole bunch of other offences, including some drug offences, some driving offences. And it's basically, it's insanely political, because it's basically politicians saying, we don't trust the judges to punish people or to protect society from criminals. We're going to impose tough sentences. And usually they get talked about in election campaigns. So usually it's politicians going, we're tough on crime. We're going to have big minimum mandatory sentencing. It's not just the territory. Queensland's got them. New South Wales has got them. You can hear my voice. I'm dual citizen, Australian English, Australian British. Britain's just talking about introducing them as well in the run-up to what will be a general election. And you see the same thing again. Politicians are saying, I'm going to win, basically, crudely put, I'm going to win votes if I sound tough on crime. So let's do this. But the thing is, they don't work. The laws don't work. I could talk about this for a while. I get a bit excited about it. But when you've seen it up close, like, you know, I've been into prison. I've met Zak. He was sent to prison for murder he didn't physically commit. So it's kind of alive for me, as well as being a kind of a dry academic issue.
What is Zak like when you met him? How would you describe him?
Zak he's a big bear of a man. So I'm 6 foot something, 6'3", I think. He's my height, if not taller, and he's bigger than me. But he's not bigger in that kind of cut, muscly sense. He's bigger in a cuddly sense. I remember I once asked one of his friends, because I spent a lot of the time working on this book, which took me years, was trying to work out if Zak actually did it, like whether he was telling the truth. And I remember talking to one of his close friends. I remember saying, have you ever seen Zak be violent? And she thought about it. And then in all seriousness, she said to me, is a tickle attack violent? I was like, no, it's not. It's a tickle attack. She was like, yeah, Zak would give me a tickle attack. I was like, all right, okay. He's a cuddly bear of a man. He keeps surprising me, in all honesty. He is gentle. He is thoughtful. He's decent. He's, for a convicted murderer, very honest. He has helped me, strangely, through some tough times, just by being there. I mean, this was by post, because he was in prison. I was in a different country. So, but he was there. And he has got an incredible imagination. He wants to be a writer. And one of the things that sustained him in prison, like prison, I can't imagine what it's like. I've been in a few and they're pretty tough. Prison in the Northern Territory is really tough. Zak sustained himself through a long time in prison by writing science fiction books. Like he'd imagine entire worlds, entire universes, and kind of disappear into them in his head. And I've asked him, do you think that actually got you through? And he was like, oh yeah, definitely. That was the thing that got me through. Just being able to escape. Like you could lock him up physically, but you couldn't lock up his mind. He's not perfect in any way. Like he did agree to take part in a murder, which was wrong. And it was a nasty murder. But he's kind of a nice guy. And I like him and he's a friend. And he's a convicted murderer. I had to make a decision when we were writing these letters to each other early on, whether I put my address on the back of the envelope so he could write back. And I can remember thinking, okay, I'll do it. But it's not just my address, it's my kid's address. And I am giving my house address to a guy who's been convicted of murder. And I think at that point, on some level I hadn't really thought about, that was me accepting that Zak was an okay guy. Because if I hadn't accepted that, I wouldn't have done that. They're my kids.
Yeah.
So that's a very long answer. Zak is He's like everyone. He's good and he's bad, but he's mainly a big softie. He'd hate it if he heard me say that. But he is.
So if he doesn't hear this interview then. Dan, let's go back to the beginning.
Okay.
How did you get involved in this case? Because you said...
For all the wrong reasons.
Okay. Tell me.
Really blunt. I was a newspaper reporter. I'd done a bunch of reporting on a completely unrelated case, unsolved murder of 3 children. Like I said, I get to do all the happy, optimistic stuff. But I'd done a bunch of reporting on that case, and it had gone pretty well. And on the back of that, the suspected killer was sent back to court. It got a lot of political attention. It won a couple of awards, and I was feeling pretty clever about myself. And because being a journo, you're facing your names out there a bit. People came to me after that and said, "Oh, what's the next project you want to work on? Or do you want to work together?" Because everyone loves success. And I wanted to win another award. I kind of got a taste of fame and success. Not fame, mini fame and success. And I wanted more of it. And that was kind of selfish, but it's true. And one guy came to me, a film producer, phenomenal journalist, guy called Ivan O'Mani. And he said, I'd really like to try working together. And here's a story I think it would be interesting to work on. And he showed me a magazine feature written about Zak. And this was a long time ago now, almost a decade ago. And it was in that magazine feature, I read that line from the judge saying that the law itself creates injustice. And that was how I started. But I didn't start for any of the right reasons, which are that here was a tremendous injustice and a guy who was in prison, and I was going to come and help him because I wanted to help him. To be really honest, I looked at it and I thought, this is a fascinating case. This illuminates some fascinating issues, and I might win another award if I do this. And that was my motivation, and it was all wrong. And I look back on it and I'm not proud of it, but that is why I started. And then it all got complicated because I started to care a bit about it.
Yeah.
and that's where we are today. I probably care too much. We did like a mini documentary series on Zak's case, and that went pretty well. And I did win an award, or we won an award because it's a team effort. And that was great. And then I kind of felt a bit clever about myself. And it was at that point, after that, I got a call from Zak's dad, which is the starting point in the book. So I'd been to Catherine, I'd done a bunch of reporting. I felt clever about myself. I got a call from Zak's dad with a message from Zak saying, Zak wants you to grow some balls and defend him. It took me a while to work this out, but what he meant was, Zak was saying, you've done some reporting, but it's not brave. And if you're going to look at this case, you need to be brave and you need to pick a side. You need to decide if you believe Zak. And if you believe Zak, then it's not enough to just stand back and be the objective reporter with his hands off who writes the story. You actually have to get involved and choose whose side you're on. And if you believe Zak didn't do it, then you have to defend him. And then it took me a while to face up to that, because it's a lot easier to stand back and not get involved, particularly get involved emotionally. But then I did. And that was when I essentially went back over all of the investigation we'd done up to that point, which was months and months of work. And I reread every document. I re-interviewed every person. I went back to Catherine. I physically went and met Zak in prison. I basically kind of re-interrogated the case from start to finish. And in the process of that, started writing letters to Zak. In fact, the first letter we exchanged was he sent me a letter to apologize for telling me to grow some balls. He said in that moment, he was really angry. And it wasn't, it was the anger coming out. And he said, look, I just wanted to write and say sorry. So the first letter I got from him was him saying, I'm sorry. And then I wrote back, and then he wrote back, and then I kind of was like, oh, okay. And that's been at least 6 years now, I think.
Wow. 6
years now, and a lot of letters. Like a stack of letters. And it's really nice getting letters because no one else writes. It's funny.
I was going to say, what has receiving and writing to Zak meant to you over that time? Like that's a pretty incredible thing.
The story of the book was supposed to be the story of Zak's case. And this is a really long answer, so bear with me. The story of the book was supposed to be the story of Zak's case, one of those true crime books where you just tell the case of what happened from start to finish, and you stand back and you be the reporter who's hands off and doesn't get involved. Except that the process of writing letters to Zak came at a tough point in my life. After I finished that reporting on Zak's case, I actually left my job and we moved across the world. We moved back to the UK and lived there. And it just didn't go really well. And I wasn't working. And then I got a job I hated and was doing these massive commutes that meant I never saw the kids and didn't have any friends because we'd moved to a new place and it was cold and dark and wet because it was the UK. And I got really depressed. Like, I got really properly depressed. I remember there was one particular moment, because when you're depressed, like, you pull everyone else down. You don't mean to or want to, and you hate yourself for doing it, but of course you do, because you're like a negative force within the family. And through all of that, I didn't have anyone to talk to, partly because blokes aren't great at talking, and partly because I didn't know anyone where I was living. And so I used to write to Zak, and it was easier to write to Zak because I didn't have to see his reaction. So I could say things about, how I was feeling, what was going right, what was going wrong. And it wasn't like I was telling another bloke, because a lot of blokes aren't great at that. Should be better, but we're not. And I'm one of them. But I could just put it all in a letter and literally just send it off to this person who at that point I thought I'll never have to meet him because he's actually in jail for life. And so I could tell him all this stuff and it became like a release valve. But then he started writing back. And he was really nice and really supportive. Like, they're not gushing, flowing emotional letters, because it is still two fairly unreconstructed blokes putting stuff in print, but at least we're talking a bit. And there was one letter, which I'm pretty sure I mentioned this in the book, but I was doing 4 hours of commuting each day to get to this job. So 2 hours there, 2 hours back, and I hated the job. So I was miserable. I was getting up before the kids woke up and I was getting home after they'd gone to sleep. So I never saw my kids except when they were asleep. And I remember Zak in his letter, he actually added up the number of hours that would be over a week, a month, a year. And then he said, that's the amount of time you could be spending time with family. And I looked at it and I forget the figure, but it was frightening. Like, over a year, that many hours. And I was like, what am I doing? And I ended up leaving that job. And that wasn't the only reason, but it was actually a big part of it. And it was probably the point that kind of kicked me into the decision-making process to leave that job. So I kind of left my job on the basis of what Zak said in the letter. And that became part of our friendship. Well, no, it became a friendship. I suppose it was a professional relationship. And then it became a friendship. And then, brilliantly, because life kicks you sometimes, I was coming out of that depression and things were going better and the weather was better. And this must have been like after a couple of years, but I can clearly remember walking with my daughter and our dog. At that point I had 2 kids. I was off with the youngest one. She was running ahead, chasing the dog. The sun was out. It was like green fields and it was just like everything was beautiful. And I can remember I was thinking about the future and I can remember thinking to myself, hang on, this is the first time I've thought about the future for a long time. This is great. And then I got a phone call from my wife who had taken our eldest daughter to the doctors because she had this funny bump in her tummy. And my wife's in tears because she's been referred to the hospital. It turns out our daughter had cancer. And the funny bump in her tummy was a huge tumour, like grapefruit-sized tumour. And, and in that moment, like, just the earth stood still. The bit of earth I was standing on stood still, and then the earth just started spinning around me. That was 2 years of pretty intense treatment. Like, a lot of people have gone through or know someone who's gone through cancer. Probably everyone knows someone who's gone through cancer. Until you see it up close, you don't realise how tough that treatment is. Like, round after round after round of chemo, surgery, immunotherapy, radiotherapy, and so on and so on. And so I kept writing to Zak, and he kept writing back. And his family kind of rallied around me at that point. Like, his mum, I was speaking to his mum quite a bit on the phone. She's a really impressive woman. And she told me to buy a pink crystal because it would have healing properties. And, what I had to do was put it under Poppy's pillow and then wash it every so often to wash away the bad energy. And I didn't really believe it, but I did do it. So Zak and his family became a huge amount of support through that whole process, but all of it with Zak by post. You can do a lot in a letter. They're kind of amazing. And I don't write to anyone else, so it was great.
And all of this was from the UK, by the way.
Yeah, so the initial work I did, I was in Sydney for the newspaper, and then we moved back to the UK, and so Zak and I writing letters to each other for years, year after year after year in the UK.
Takes a while to get round.
That's the funny thing. Sometimes it took months. Like you'd write a letter, you'd post it, it would go halfway around the world, but then it had to get into the prison and it had to be screened, because probably everything that goes into a prison is screened. And that could take quite a while. And then Zak would, read it, but you don't always respond immediately. You're busy. You've got stuff on. Zak didn't have as much as I did because he was locked up in prison. But, he'd reply after a bit, and then it would have to be screened on the way out through the prison. So the letters I was getting came stamped with, Northern Territory Department of Corrections, or just stamped with the word screened, because every single word of our conversation by post was being read, or I had to assume it was. I don't know if they actually were that interested, but they had the ability to read every word of our letters. So it could, honestly, for one letter to go back could take months. But Zak was doing this with other people. He was playing noughts and crosses with his dad by post. So he started doing this with me after a while. You draw the noughts and crosses board, put a move in, post it, put a move in, send it back, and so on and so on. And I've got a copy of one of the sheets he did this with his dad. And it's got the dates on it, and you can tell they've played noughts and crosses over about 9 months. But the sheet of paper is also got loads of doodles, like smiley faces, and his dad's written "I love you" in the corner. And that kind of tangible stuff with a letter is kind of gorgeous. Like Zak wouldn't just write, he'd draw pictures. He can draw a bit. He loves drawing, and he'd draw pictures, or sometimes he'd draw diagrams of my answers. Like at one point he asked me how long I thought he should have got in prison. And I kind of tried to avoid answering because I didn't want to judge him, or I was scared of judging him. Or maybe I was scared of what he'd think if I judged it. I don't know, but I tried to avoid answering it. And after a couple of letters where I was avoiding it, he wrote back saying, "You still haven't given me an answer. I would like an actual guesstimate, please." And then I gave him this kind of waffly, avoiding kind of answer. And his next letter, he drew this big spiraling arrow that got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And in the middle, he wrote, "Your answer started here." And then at the end, he wrote, "and ended here." Yeah, he was right. It did. But all of that, and even the way people write, like the way he shapes his letters, like the way he spells some things right, some things wrong. It's got this weird habit of, they're called ellipses, like 3 dots on a line. And we often use them in text when we're missing words out. You'll put like ... or this sentence trails off ... Zak uses them in a letter to break up his thoughts. So he'll be writing, I was doing such and such ... and then a completely different thought, and then ... and then a third completely different thought. So he's got this own punctuation he's devised. But as you're reading the letter, you can actually just see how his mind is working. You get all of that in a letter. They're really, really amazing things that we don't use very much anymore.
Yeah, it's incredible. Let's talk about the investigation, the process of writing this book, Dan. You're interviewing all of these people. I know that a lot of this was done, many years ago from when you were writing the book. I just often think, how hard was it to hold all of those stories? Because as you said, this is a bit of an ambiguous case. The person who was murdered, not the greatest. And you've got all kinds of people with all kinds of different stories and all kinds of opinions of Zak and what happened and what didn't happen. And you have to assume when you put them all out there that some of the people are lying, that you're not going to get the whole truth.
Yeah, this is a really interesting one. as a reporter, I like the idea of objective truth. That's what we're supposed to do. But it's it is actually completely impossible.
I don't think there's such thing.
No.
Not when people are involved.
No, maybe there is in maths or something. But you're right. When people are involved, there's not. Because, I mean, I put this in the afterword to the book. Like, for example, a lot of the book's based on what Zak's told me. But in his letters, we both knew the prison was going to be reading it. So he wasn't completely honest. He might also have been lying at different times about what he did know about this murder or what actually he didn't know. A bunch of other people were certainly lying. So I did a lot of stuff off the court transcripts and the interviews that some of the suspects gave to police. And you can prove that they're lying and some of them admit to lying and say, look, everything I've told you up to this point is a lie, but this is the truth. And then you look at it and you compare it against the other things you know, and you're like, well, no, they're actually still lying at this point. So you're dealing, and also people don't consciously lie, but they tell you the version of the truth that's closest to what they want you to believe. Like even the judge. So I sat down with the judge who sent Zak to prison, and this was when I was with Ivan, we had a long conversation with him, and I've dealt with him since by email and spoken to him, and he was never going to lie to me. He's a judge, and I think he's a very good judge, but he's also going to be very conscious that what he says in the conversation with me, I'm going to go away and report publicly. So he's going to give me a version of the truth that's for public consumption, if you like. So I asked him, how did it feel to send a guy to prison for life when you didn't think he was guilty of the crime? And he doesn't tell me, I hated it, it was appalling. He doesn't swear, he doesn't shout. He tells me, it was very disappointing, which is the publicly consumable version of the fact that he hated it and he did everything he could to make sure that his disapproval was registered in the proper judicial way by saying on the record that he thought these laws created injustice. So you get kind of people shape their versions of the truth, and then you as the reporter get all these different versions, some of which are just not true, some of which are incomplete, some of which are shaped for you, and then you try and smash those together and come up with a version that is the best. Okay, so talking about honesty, what I tried to do in this book was be more honest than I've probably ever been before in my reporting. And I've written a couple of other books as well. And I tried to actually, in this one, just actually be a bit more honest. So there's bits where I accept, this part of the book, I don't know what happened. In fact, there's two versions of what happened on this night. Here's version A, here's version B. I can't tell you objectively the true version. I've just got a lot of partial accounts. It's not a very satisfying answer, that, is it? I can't tell you. We do the best we can, and I think you've got to be fair, and I think you've got to be decent, and I think you've got to be honest as a reporter. But sometimes that probably, we as reporters need to admit that sometimes we can't get it right. And the more we do that, the more human our reporting is. But as a class, like journalists, we're not very good at telling people we're not right, because we're also a massively arrogant class of people. A lot of journos have real ego problems, and I include myself in that number. We should admit our limitations more. The book's as honest as I could make it, is the short answer.
There's a quote in the book that I really liked when you were going around interviewing, and you said, to our minds, this was justified. If I thought about the impact on them of what we were doing, I dismissed it. How much did you have to compartmentalize what you were doing? Because this interviews like that and dredging up events that have destroyed lives, like that does have an impact on people.
It does, and I've seen it. I was at a journalist event last night, and before we went in, I was talking to another journalist who I respect hugely, and we were talking about how often people cry in conversations with us. And it's true, because by the nature of what we do, we're usually talking to people about some of the most, not just always worst, but extreme things that have happened to them, because those are the newsworthy things that have happened to them. And you're right, in the process of talking to them, we dredge it all up, and we kind of bring it all out into the open, and often they bare their souls to us. And there's a part of me that is always in wonder that people will do this. Usually I'm a complete stranger, and they put a lot of trust in you as a reporter to do the right thing by them and their story. And often we make people cry, and I don't enjoy it, and I don't take any pride in it. But I do, as I get older, start to recognise that impact. So I made Bronwyn cry because I asked her about her life. And she opened up and told me a lot that helped me understand what happened with this murder of Ray and how she ended up paying for Ray to be killed. And I understood that better, so I could do my job of reporting it better. And at the end of it, she also felt better. She told me she felt better. In that there's a sense of catharsis. But that wasn't guaranteed. And even to get to that point of catharsis, there was a lot of emotional upheaval that I kind of, as reporters, Ivan and I, subjected her to. And when you're working on one of these stories as a reporter, you're literally going around knocking on doors and trying to find people. And basically, you have to be at peace with the fact that you are going to cause a lot of emotional upheaval for people in the pursuit of what you see as the story. And you have to justify that to yourself. And in this case, I did justify that to myself. I was working as a reporter on a story about, bluntly, a miscarriage of justice. I was going to do the right thing by bringing that to a wider audience. And in the end, Zak was actually released from prison earlier. But to do that, I literally had to go around chasing people and asking them to tell me about what was probably the worst thing that had happened in their lives. So knocking on doors, will you tell me about the murder of your friend, your neighbour, your family member? We knocked on people's doors, and when they said no, we sometimes went back. And sometimes when they said no again, we went back. We as journalists force ourselves on people to try and tell these stories. And if we're good journalists, we've got a good reason for doing that. And in this case, I think there was a good reason for doing it, and I'm proud of the outcome. Coincidentally, the book was actually published the week that Zak got out of prison. Partly in the process of doing the initial reporting on Zak's case, decision was made to start looking at his case in the sort of the legal world in the Northern Territory, and they eventually decided to release him early. And they said the case was in an anomaly, and that was terrific. And then he was going through the process of working towards his parole, and it was all very uncertain whether or not he was going to get it. And then the book was being written and was going to come out, and it just happened to be that the two things coincided. So I got a text from Zak like a few days after the book was published saying, "Hi, mate, I'm having lunch with my family." And I can remember, like, emotionally, I'd known he was supposed to get out, and I'd known it was even supposed to happen that day because his family had been sending me some messages. But I don't know if I really ever believed it was really going to happen. This guy who I'd spent years and years writing to was actually going to get out of prison, until I got a text message from him saying he was out. But I've spoken to him a couple of times, and I've arranged to go up and see him next month in the Territory. And he said to me the last time I spoke to him on the phone, he said, "I haven't read the book yet." And I said, "Look, don't, because I've got a copy and I'll bring it up and I'll give it to you." And he said, "Well, that'll be the copy I read." And that will be a tremendous feeling. Because there's a lot of Zak in the book, like, and you've read it obviously, but there's bits of his letters, and the book's kind of guided as much by his voice as I could kind of make it. So to actually be able to give him this book that he is a part of will be a great thing. Oh, look, he might not like it. There's always that possibility. It'll be a great feeling, and then I might get a call like 3 days later saying, "I can't believe you put that in."
What does Zak's life look like, Dan? Because parole doesn't mean free.
No, that's a really good point. It doesn't. And Zak's never going to be free. So Zak's out of prison, but he's on parole for the rest of his life. So parole like, as I'm sure you know, basically means we're letting you out of prison before your sentence expires, subject to certain conditions. But Zak's got a life sentence. So Zak is on parole for the rest of his life. And the conditions of that parole basically mean he's currently got an ankle bracelet. He has to report to the police weekly, I think. That will get easier. But the parole basically means that if Zak commits any other offence, no matter how minor, gets drunk, has a fight in the street, he's back in prison and he will serve the rest of his sentence, which in Zak's case is the rest of his life. So Zak knows he can't do anything wrong from this point on. He is also got to rebuild a life. He's a young bloke. He was 19 when he went in. He's in his 30s now. So he's got a whole life ahead of him. He's been offered work, which is a game changer. He's got somewhere to stay with his family, but he's got to rebuild a life from the fragments.
He's a 19-year-old kid in a 30-something-year-old body. He's missed out on so much of the world.
Yes. Driver's license. He said I was on the phone to him and he said, I've just spent 4 hours on the phone to the tax office trying to convince them I'm not dead because they haven't got any tax records for me for the last 12 years. And he said he spent 4 hours trying to convince them that he was actually alive and that he hadn't been defrauding them. And he said he basically said to them in the end, look, Google my name. And so the guy on the phone in the tax office Googled Zak Grieve and went, oh, right, yeah, okay. And so he's got to build everything, all that paperwork of a daily life, he's got to do from scratch. And he's got to do all of that with the stigma of being a convicted murderer. And all the nice things I've said about him are true. But everyone he meets and says, oh, hi, I'm Zak, can I have a job? Or can I rent this car? He's going to say, I'm Zak, the convicted murderer. Can I have this job? That's not easy. Friendships, like a lot of the people he was mates with in Catherine, that murder it's a small town. It divided it. You know, there were people there who were friends with the family of the victim. There were people there who were friends with the family of the killers. Like the town was split apart by that. Zak's friendships from that time have fragmented. He talks about whether or not he even wants or can trust himself to pick up those friendships again because he doesn't want to go back to the place he was in at that point. He's got to rebuild all of this. So I remember when I went to see him in prison, we'd been talking about the book and writing letters about the book for a long time. And when I met him in prison in Darwin, he said to me, how does the book end? And I said, well, the last chapter is the one you've got to write, Zak, because this is you starting the rest of your life when you get out. And that's the hardest chapter. So he's right at the beginning of writing that chapter now. And I think it's going to be difficult. It's going to be great, and I hope it works, but I don't think it's going to be easy at all. But life continues. He's going to face all those adversities, and I'll be on the end of the phone when he needs, and I'll go and see him, and he'll deal with all those challenges. But life will continue. He will build his life from this point. He will write that chapter. That's pretty amazing, actually.
Dan Box, it has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for being here.
No, thank you. I really enjoyed that. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Dan Box for sharing his incredible story today. To read more about Zak's case and Dan's tireless investigation, The Man Who Wasn't There is available now wherever you get your books. And the updates on Zak's case since publishing the book, including his release on parole, can be found in the show notes. I'm Georgia, and thank you for listening to this episode of Finding Hope. To help this podcast reach more people, you can rate, review, subscribe, and share it with a friend who might need a little extra hope right now. For now, I'll leave you with this verse. But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. Romans 8, verse 25. Catch you next time.
This is a Hope 1032 production. Thanks for listening.